Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, as I mentioned in my previous reaction, I would be taking a look at one about George Washington's presidency. And full disclosure, this is actually a video that I did a reaction to about a week ago. Recorded the whole thing. I was not feeling great that day to begin with, kind of dragged myself up here to record. Recorded the whole thing only to find out that there was some kind of glitch in the matrix, so to speak, and something happened with my microphone and it kept making noise, and had never had that happen with this mic before, so basically the whole thing was unusable. So I have watched this video. I have recorded an entire reaction to it. We're going to do it again. So if you didn't see the previous episode, which was a reaction to a different channel where we looked at the time between the Articles of Confederation and George Washington becoming president and what that looked like in the United States. That is kind of a precursor to this one where we're going to actually look at the presidency of George Washington. This is from Knowledgia, which is a channel we've done reactions to before. And before we dive into this one, I want to thank Monty Roberts and Alex Yursky. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. Now more than ever, with the way things are going with YouTube and a lot of AI channels out there now that are just making a lot of slop that may or may not even be good history. Your support on Patreon means more than ever for whatever channels you support, whether it's mine or someone else's. I am proud to be a patron for 12 channels that I support, and I would encourage anyone, if you love the content creators and you watch a lot of their content, I cannot stress enough how much Patreon really does make a difference to many of these channels, so mine included. Thank you so much for that. Let's dive in.
George Washington entered the office of president in April 1789 with a nation to put in order. He would need to lead the way as the Constitution was put in practice for the first time. On top of that, he had a host of other problems to deal with. Massive debt, unorganized and unsettled territories.
So we talk about this all the time. Big motivation behind the revolution is all of this territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, which includes, I mean, you see here, some of that Iroquois territory there, the western part of Pennsylvania, what we now call West Virginia, western North Carolina, South Carolina, most of Georgia is unsettled at this time. The states don't look like they do today at this time. Vermont's not a state. It's being disputed over. Maine is part of Massachusetts. But all of this territory is opening up, and you're going to see a massive spread west. And so Washington's going to have to deal with ongoing conflicts as Americans go west and they run into British fur traders and some outposts that are still there. They're going to run into the Spanish, who own everything west of the Mississippi. They're running into a lot of Native American tribes which sided with the British during the war.
Conflict with Native Americans, relations with both Britain and France, and the increasingly divided political factions of his nation. In this video, we will follow Washington throughout his presidency as he did his best to lead America in its formative years. We will see how he succeeded and the areas in which he failed and that his successors would have to deal with after him.
So, I mean, think about a situation here. You have a brand new nation and you have a new constitution that is completed in 1787. It's ratified in 1788, and Washington's going to become president in April of 1789. It's a brand new form of government for a brand new nation. You are the first person to hold this position of president. There's a little bit of guidelines about what that looks like in the Constitution, but for the most part, you're making it up as you go along. There's a lot of pressure, and honestly, if it had been a different person, who knows what the presidency looks like today.
Building the American system. Many details of the presidency were undefined in 1789. Therefore, almost anything Washington did could be impressed upon the office as tradition. So, Washington's choice to give an inauguration speech became a custom followed by every president after him.
Right. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that's in the Constitution. You must give an inauguration speech, right? I mean, so many things go all the way back to him. And, a lot of things, this is trial and error. If a president does something that's never been done before, He could claim, well, it's in my implied powers, it's in my constitutional duty to uphold the Constitution to do this, and then it's for the other branches of government to either say, well, yeah, you're right, and then let it go, or to step in and pass laws, or have a court come in and say, no, we're going to limit that area of your perceived power.
So too was the title of Mr. President, which Washington preferred to other monarchical-sounding honorifics like Your Excellency.
Yeah, John Adams is the vice president, and he's also the president of the Senate, and he tried really hard to get all these like lofty titles for the president. And there's a funny scene, I don't know how true it is, of John Adams presiding over the Senate in the show John Adams, and he's throwing out all these titles, and he's like, president, cricket club has a president, this has got to be something more than that. And then there's a scene later where where John Adams walks away from Washington and he says, Mr. President. And Washington looks at him and says, Mr. President, and no more. That's all I want to be called.
To staff his government, Washington appointed the first cabinet, including John Adams as vice president, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury.
So all of these guys are people he has a history with. John Adams is the man who actually makes the motion to make George Washington the commander-in-chief of the Army in the first place, all the way back in 1775. Henry Knox is his chief of artillery during the war. Thomas Jefferson, of course, writes the Declaration of Independence, and so he and Washington serve side by side in the Continental Congress. They're both from Virginia. Alexander Hamilton is Washington's de facto chief of staff during the war. So these are all people that he trusts. Hamilton wasn't the first choice. He kind of falls into the position. I shouldn't say falls into it. He's definitely qualified, but he was kind of the second choice. Adams not really part of the cabinet, but you have to understand at this time the cabinet was way more influential and way more important and way more powerful than it is today. Today they kind of run departments, right? I mean, they have authority over very large departments. State Department, huge. Treasury Department, huge. But at that time, they were really seen as, next to the president, the most powerful people in the government. In fact, Secretary of State becomes the primary kind of stepping stone to the presidency for the first several decades of the United States history.
Even here, things were still unclear. For example, Vice President Adams was quite confused at what his job even was. He was both the Vice President and the President of the Senate, two roles with undefined powers that left him complaining that he'd been given the most pointless office ever conceived by man.
Yeah, and he'll go back to Boston and spend a lot of time at his farm out in what is now Quincy, Massachusetts, which, if you ever get the chance, go to the Adams houses. Incredible history. Really, really cool to see.
One of Washington's most pressing concerns was to prop up the judiciary. It was the least defined branch in the Constitution, and Washington would help give it much of its form. With the Judiciary Act of 1789, and appointed John Jay as its first Chief Justice.
Yeah, and John Jay is one of those founding fathers we don't hear a lot about, but super important. He's another New Yorker. He's involved in negotiating important treaties for the early United States. First Chief Justice. Yeah, there's nothing in the Constitution that says, for example, how many justices there are to be on the Supreme Court. And at this point, the Supreme Court doesn't really have that judicial review power that it's going to take upon itself. Much like the president, where the president is going to say, you know what, it doesn't really say one way or another, so I'm just going to declare that I have the authority to do X, Y, Z. And then it's for the other branches to rein them in or to allow it. The Supreme Court under John Marshall is going to say, you know what, we get to review any laws that are passed to determine whether they're constitutional or not. It's not written in the Constitution that the Supreme Court has that power.
He further expanded upon this with lower district courts with judges appointed by the presidency to protect and apply federal law. The federal judiciary system that Washington established remains the basis of the system today.
Yep.
Perhaps the most urgent concern for most people was to enshrine people's rights in the new system. The Constitution did not provide clear protections for people's individual rights and liberties, a failure which its critics had seized upon in the ratification process.
That's a really important distinction he makes there, because that's very much, the Constitution is about kind of overall rights for the states, for the federal government. It doesn't talk about individual rights. And we tie the Bill of Rights so closely in our mind to the Constitution because it happens so quickly afterwards that we forget that it's actually a distinct addition to the Constitution. You know, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, these things, the Fifth Amendment. And all of these are direct repudiations of things that they had seen as necessary changes from the previous government they had, either under the Articles of Confederation or under the British. Things like how the British would quarter troops in Boston, so they intentionally put one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights to be that the government doesn't have the right to do that. The right to a fair and speedy trial, the right to not incriminate yourself in court, freedom of religion, and that was an important one because the British government had a state church. It was the Church of England. And it was the church that every citizen was required to pay tithes to, whether you believed in it or not. And so it was important for the federal government now to say, you know what, we're not going to have an established church. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free practice thereof. You don't have to be a member of a state church. You don't have to be a member of a church at all if you don't want to be.
Several of the states, such as Massachusetts, had only ratified the Constitution with the condition that such protections be added. Washington also agreed, calling in his inaugural address for basic rights to be impregnably fortified in a new constitutional amendment.
Yeah, there was no guarantee that the Constitution was going to be adopted. They needed 9 states of the 13 to adopt it. And there's a big sales job that has to be done between the time that the Constitution is adopted and when it's ratified by the states. And so you have John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison writing all of these essays that are known as the Federalist Papers. And these are directly written to the people under pseudonyms. They'd use names like Publius, and they'd write these things directly. Primarily, they're geared toward the state legislatures that are going to be voting to ratify the Constitution, but in a larger sense to the people in general. And to this day, they are used by the Supreme Court as they try to interpret what the intention of the law was, what the intention of the Constitution was when they look at what these guys wrote.
Support for such a Bill of Rights was not universal. Some critics argued that the Constitution, by strictly outlining the few powers the government had, carried an implied protection of rights that was good enough anyway. These voices were overpowered, though, and largely thanks to the works of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, the Bill of Rights was introduced to Congress in September 1789.
Remember, the government they came from, the British government, has a constitution, but it's not written down like ours is. It's not a specific list. The Constitution is more of an idea of a collection of all of the laws. And so they're like, no, we're not playing this. Yeah, we have a Constitution game. We want it written down. We want it enshrined specifically so we know exactly what we're talking about.
Proposed as a set of 10 distinct amendments, the Bill of Rights included provisions for religious freedom, freedom of speech, the right to a fair trial, and the right to bear arms. The Bill of Rights was ratified by the states over the following 2 years, becoming enshrined in the Constitution in December 1791. Disaster in the Northwest. Physical expansion went hand in hand with the conceptual expansion of the U.S. Washington would oversee the admittance of 3 new states, Vermont in 1791, Kentucky in 1792, and Tennessee in 1796. Such expansion was anticipated by the Constitution, and the Americans expected that more states would join in time. However, mixed among these successes were a series of dismal failures in the Northwest territories that soured Washington's first years as president.
And all of this is all history is connected. French and Indian War are part of the 7 Years' War. is directly tied to why the revolution happens. The revolution happens because of things that are going to come after, and these things are all connected. The Northwest Territory is just a continuation of the North American part of the revolution, which was a continuation of the French and Indian War. It's a continued conflict between these now citizens of the United States, before that colonists, and the Native Americans who live in these regions.
Since the implementation of the Northwest Ordinance, the Indians in the Northwest Territory had resisted American settlers with ferocity and success. A military man with newfound presidential powers, one of Washington's first acts was to deal with them. Secretary Knox agreed, and they dispatched General Josiah Harmer to lead a campaign in the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Indian War was far more difficult than Washington anticipated. The assorted alliance of Native Americans, quietly backed by the British, was a formidable match for the untested American soldiers.
And remember, too, that the United States does not have a standing army at this point, and won't have a standing army until John Adams is president. And even then, it's kind of only temporary. So you're largely dealing with militias that are getting called up to federal service.
Harmer's mission was to destroy native villages and rout their warriors. But on October 21st, 1790, it was Harmer's men who were devastated in the Battle of Kikianga in future Indiana. Hundreds of Americans were killed or wounded, and survivors said it was as if you could have walked from one side of the river to the other on the bodies left floating in the water.
Don't hear much about that.
Eager to rectify the defeat, Washington then ordered Major General Arthur St. Clair to launch another campaign. On November 4th, 1791, as St. Clair's army marched against Indian settlements along the Wabash River in Ohio, they were attacked by over 1,000 Indian men, led by the Miami war chief, Little Turtle. The battle became known as the St. Clair Defeat.
Which tells you a little bit about how this went for St. Clair and the Americans. Devastating battle.
600 Americans were killed, making it the single greatest defeat the United States ever suffered at the hands of the Native Americans. With a fatality...
I mean, think about that. That's more than double the number that were with Custer when he was wiped out at the Little Bighorn. This is a significant defeat at a time when the United States is still fairly small, and spreading into the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Ordinance is passed in 1787, which is meant to start planning for this territory to become states. And they even build into it a system by which they can achieve statehood, and Ohio is going to become the first state out of all of that. And these defeats are happening, and suddenly you're thinking, wow, are we getting a little bit ahead of ourselves? Maybe we're not ready for this.
Rate of 60%, it was proportionally the worst defeat the U.S. Army has ever suffered in a major battle. Washington laid the blame firmly at St. Clair's feet. The controversy prompted Congress to begin the first ever official investigation of the executive branch, where a committee concluded that Secretary Knox had failed to properly supply the Army, but no action was taken to hold anyone to account.
Fascinating look at the early times in the executive. If you read Ron Chernow's book, Hamilton, which is the book that the musical was based on, it talks a lot about those early days in New York City when the government departments are being grown, and you've got we don't have a Justice Department, so you have the Attorney General in charge of his department. You have the State Department. You have the Treasury Department. You have the War Department. The War Department has like a handful of employees, and the State Department, or the Treasury Department by this point, has got like hundreds of employees. It's just the difference between how Knox handled the job and how Hamilton went into the job.
Instead, Washington and Congress used the disaster to expand the Army, raise military pay, and pass the Militia Acts that forcibly enrolled all fighting-age men in their state's militia to be called upon when the need arose. Economics and finance. Fortunately for Washington, his administration's efforts in other departments were much more successful, especially in matters of finance and the economy.
Hamilton.
Washington's appointment of Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary proved to be one of the best choices he ever made. A shrewd, intelligent, and ambitious man, Hamilton took on...
All true. Hamilton's one of the most brilliant people we have ever had in government. The guy was absolutely a genius. And like many geniuses, he was his own worst enemy in terms of his decision, in terms of his rashness at times, but absolutely brilliant.
On the immense task of organizing the nation's financial affairs. Hamilton began by consolidating the nation's debt into a federal national debt that the U.S. could begin repaying to establish its value to creditors. To ensure the government had more money to hand, he issued government bonds and implemented new tariffs and taxes. Hamilton also led the way on the establishment of the U.S. Mint to standardize coinage across the U.S.
So the assumption plan, where they assumed the state's debts, is seen by the folks like Thomas Jefferson and many others who really preferred the Articles of Confederation. They liked a loose collection of states under a very weak federal government. They see Hamilton as accumulating power, which, centralizing the authority does that. And so they oppose that. And so Hamilton needs their support. And this is the early stages of what's going to become our two-party system. And in order to get the support that is needed for his assumption plan in Congress from people like James Madison, who's one of the leaders in Congress, he needs to have a compromise. And so they have this very famous dinner table compromise that happens in New York City. And there's a sign there. You can actually see the site where this happened. It's Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. Nobody knows for sure what went on. It's a big part of the Hamilton musical. It's the song The Room Where It Happens. I want to be in the room where it happens. They come out with this plan where the folks like the Virginians are going to vote for the assumption plan in exchange for the new U.S. Capitol being built on the shores of the Potomac River, which puts it a lot closer to Virginia. In fact, initially, the District of Columbia is carved out of Virginia and Maryland. Today, only the Maryland part is still D.C., but originally that part across the river where like Arlington, Alexandria are, that was part of D.C. as well.
His economic reforms expanded federal power, much to the anger of certain states, mainly in the South, who resented the consolidation of power in a distant capital. To get these resistant Southerners on board, Hamilton proposed a compromise. The South would accept his reforms, and in exchange, the capital would be moved southward to a new state along the Potomac River.
But it was going to take 10 years to do that, and so in the meantime, we'll move it to Philadelphia. So it's only briefly in New York City the first year or two. Then they move to Philadelphia, and then when D.C. is ready enough, they move to Washington.
At the middle of the current U.S. territory. The Compromise of 1790 convinced the South to support Hamilton's financial plan, including federal assumption of state debts, in exchange for moving the U.S. capital southward to a new site along the Potomac River, which would later become Washington, D.C. The crowning achievement of Hamilton's financial overhaul was probably the Bank of the United States, which was chartered in 1791.
And this was necessary in order to create an institution that could assume those debts and then make payments and, borrow money from governments and things like that. And this is one of, along with tariffs, along with slavery, this is one of the major political issues of the day, and will be for the next 50 years or so, is whether or not to have a national bank.
It oversaw the nation's debt, issued loans to the government and private individuals, and issued banknotes, among other key financial roles.
The modern-day successor of it, in a sense, is the Federal Reserve.
Critics condemned it as an unconstitutional expansion of government power, but Washington stood by Hamilton's plans as a necessary and proper tool.
And that's a very specific term that's in the Constitution. It's the necessary and proper clause. And it's used to interpret what they can and can't do.
Washington largely supported Hamilton's work, but one man who generally didn't was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Hamilton represented two very different approaches to government. Hamilton favored a strong federal government with broad authority to promote trade and expand the nation's wealth, while Jefferson favored a limited federal government more in line with the Revolution's original aims and was a strong believer in states' rights and the agrarian values of small landholders.
And in this, you see the foundation of two political parties. At the time, they're the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, because the Federalists are the one in power, and the Anti-Federalists are supposed to be the ones that aren't, even though Jefferson's in the government. Eventually, the Anti-Federalists are going to become called the Democratic Republicans, or Republicans for short, but that's really confusing because then they morph under Andrew Jackson into the modern Democratic Party. But think about the American Civil War, 80 some odd years later, 60, 70 years later. You're dealing with blue, the North, a strong central government, the Union, trade and national wealth, industry, the South, states' rights, agrarian, farms, slaves. This is the foundation of all of that.
In 1789, Hamilton founded America's first official political party in the Federalist Party to act as a vehicle for his views and those of his allies. In 1791, Jefferson and Madison answered with their Democratic Republican Party. Washington generally leaned towards the Federalists, but lamented the harsh political split that was emerging under his watch. Federalists and Democratic Republicans butted head on most of the major issues of the day. Federalists lined up behind Hamilton's economic reforms. Democratic Republicans condemned them as tyrannical. When the French Revolution broke out in 1789, the Democratic Republicans welcomed it as an inspiring echo of their own revolutionary ideals, while the Federalists treated it as a radical and destructive project that lacked the restraint that had characterized the American Revolution.
Right, and remember that when the French Revolution breaks out, Thomas Jefferson's the ambassador to France. This is before before Washington's president. He's in Paris when all of this begins, and he actually is there and helps the Marquis de Lafayette. I got a stink bug flying around. Helps the Marquis de Lafayette draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and then he returns home, and that's when he becomes Secretary of State. And so he's got this kind of built-in soft spot for France, and he's got an abhorrence of the British that goes back to before the Revolution. And Hamilton is seen as very pro-monarchy, very pro-British in his form of government, and so the people who are the heads of these two factions have very strong biases in favor or against. Not that Hamilton's necessarily against France, because he was a good friend of Marquis de Lafayette. They were very close. But they're steering Washington in two very different directions, and this is going to spill over into Adams' administration.
Almost no issue passed through Congress or across the president's desk without inspiring a bitter argument between the two groups.
Yep.
Jefferson resigned his position as Secretary of State in 1793 after his 4-year term.
And Hamilton resigns not long after that himself.
However, he continued to be deeply involved in political affairs and organized opposition to various Federalist causes over the next 3 years.
Which he had already been doing while he was the Secretary of State. He had hired this guy, James Callender, and hired other people, and was printing anti-administration newspapers, some of it with federal money, crazy stuff.
Whiskey Rebellion. Among the many controversial things Hamilton pushed through for his economic program was the whiskey tax of 1791, which imposed a tax on the sale and distilling of spirits. The tax was hated by most people, and they evaded it where they could. And
think about this for a second. This is obviously, the country has just come through a revolution, a war of independence, in which one of the major issues was the implementation of taxes on specific products. But the issue really was taxation without representation. Well, these people are represented in the government, right? So it's not exactly the same issue, but this is an issue that hits particular people while leaving others alone, especially southwestern Pennsylvania, which is where you have a lot of farmers making whiskey. And so it hits them especially hard, and so they get together and they're like, no, we're not going to take this.
1794, authorities in Pennsylvania attempted to crack down on whiskey tax evaders, but when local distillers heard about the arrival of a federal marshal and a tax collector, they attacked them. Both men survived, but the door of violence had opened. The Whiskey Rebellion spread rapidly through rural Pennsylvania, recalling Shays' Rebellion years earlier, which had shown the federal government to be weak and impotent. Washington would not allow such weakness for the new government. The Militia Acts passed in the wake of the St. Clair defeat allowed for the president to mobilize a staggering 13,000 men in the militia to suppress the rebellion.
This is the same set of militia acts that are being passed that will eventually allow Abraham Lincoln in 1861 to call up 75,000 volunteers for 3 months. It's under one of those subsequent militia acts. And the reason it's that many and it's for that long is because that's what he was allowed to do by the militia acts that were in place. So Washington is seeing this, and like everything he's doing, he's setting a precedent. And he's like, we had Shays' Rebellion, now we've got this Whiskey Rebellion. We can't keep doing this. People have to submit to our government's authority. We can't have anarchy. We have to have order. And so he calls up the government. He calls up the military. He and Hamilton ride out at the head of the military. It's crazy.
Washington personally led the armies to confront the rebels, who dispersed in the face of such an overwhelming show of power. The strong response to the Whiskey Rebellion was a powerful contrast with the impotence seen in the federal government's response to Shays' Rebellion years earlier. At the same time as Washington gathering the militia to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, the U.S. finally got the upper hand in the Northwest Indian War too. With a clear victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August of 1794.
So Fallen Timbers is called that because I think there had been a tornado that had gone through there and had blown down all of the trees. And so that was just how people remembered that area, was that it looked like a bunch of fallen timbers.
Indians were forced to seek peace. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 saw the Indians accept U.S. control of the Northwest Territory and ended major fighting over it. With success against rebels and Indians, the new federal government had proven that it could do a better job dealing with crises that had paralyzed the previous federal system.
Hey, listen, Washington is a humble guy, but he's also a decisive guy when he needs to be. During the American Revolution, when you had this mutiny take place among his soldiers because they weren't being paid and they wanted to march on Congress, he rounds up the ringleaders and has them shot. Not only shot, but shot by their own men that they had led in the revolt. Had them shoot them and had them walk right up close to where they shot him in the face from a couple feet away. It was intense, but Washington's capable of this kind of decisive action.
Foreign policy. Washington similarly proved effective at navigating the perils of foreign policy.
Yes.
Washington kept quiet when the French Revolution swept through France in 1789, much to Jefferson's annoyance. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans believed America should enthusiastically support the French in their revolution, just as the French had supported them.
Right. I mean, the American cause does not see success without the French. The French fleet, the French army, French money, French guns and ammunition. We would not have won without them. And so the argument is, well, we have a treaty, and now we have to help them, because the French Revolution, it spills into a war in Europe with the British and the Austrians and others. And so in this case, though, the argument is, well, wait a second. If we're going to jump in and help the French, we're going to get pulled into another war with the British. We're going to get pulled into a war with Austria, maybe with Spain. We're so fragile. We're dealing with stuff like the Whiskey Rebellion. We don't have the finances, the resources, the military to be able to step into this.
However, Washington and the Federalists were not convinced of the merits, leadership, or self-restraint of their French counterparts.
Right, and they get an out when King Louis is executed because the treaty was made with him, and so now it's null and void anyway.
When the French Revolutionary Wars erupted between France and Britain in 1792, the French urged the Americans to join them. Citing the 1778 Franco-American alliance, the French wanted America to attack British ships as part of a shared Republican war effort.
There's again, going back to Hamilton, there's a cabinet battle song that takes place, and Hamilton very famously in this says, "We made a treaty with a king whose head is now in a basket. Would you like me to take it out and ask it? Should we honor our treaty, King Louis's head? Do whatever you want. I'm super dead." That was the argument. King Louis dead. We made our treaty with a government that doesn't exist anymore.
Jefferson, ever the Francophile, completely agreed. However, Washington was firmly opposed to getting America involved in an unnecessary war. He recognized that trade with Britain was essential to America's economy and didn't want to alienate the British.
And his vice president, John Adams, had had this incredible meeting with King George III in 1785, where we establish diplomatic relations with the British. This is super fragile. And we know that, a couple of decades later, we're going to go back to war with them, the War of 1812. So we have to be able to trade with the British Empire if we're going to have any success as a nation.
Besides, the 1778 alliance had been signed with King Louis XVI, who the French revolutionaries had just beheaded. Surely the treaty was no longer valid. To be safe, Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation of 1793, swearing off any involvement with France or Britain's wars. Angry, the French envoy Edmond Charles Genet attempted to recruit Americans to join the war privately anyway.
Yeah, Genet doing this was a major no-no, and Washington was not happy about it. I mean, he's out there legit. There's a lot of French citizens who have ended up in the eastern United States because of the revolt that happens in Haiti. And so they've come to the nearest place they could go to here. And he's trying to kind of get them riled up and turned against the government. I mean, you've got a diplomat from a foreign country trying to turn American people against their own government to try and support their cause, and Washington is livid.
Washington complains to France and got Genet recalled. But upon learning that the revolutionary government was likely to behead him, Washington gave Genet sanctuary instead. The resulting breakdown in relations with France was a blow to Jefferson and the Republicans. Relations with the other European powers improved, though. In 1794, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to negotiate the Jay Treaty to secure British evacuation from forts in the disputed Northwest Territory and establish regular trade relations.
And this was brilliant, and this was super important, and it was also incredibly unpopular among the people who supported the Democratic Republicans, because they saw this as us caving to the British. But it was important and needed to keep, the primary goal of Washington here is peace, is neutrality, is getting this brand new nation on its feet. And Adams, for all the mistakes that he makes as president, and not a great president, the Alien and Sedition Act's horrible. He's dealing with a continuation of this Britain and France thing, but to his credit, keeps us out of war as well.
Then, the next year, Pinckney's treaty settled disputes with Spain, restoring American navigation rights to the Mississippi and settling on the border between American and Spanish territory. By the time Washington's second term was drawing to a close in 1796, he had clearly done an admirable job.
Yeah.
Many people, such as John Adams, expected him to stay in the office for as long as he lived, and had he wanted to, he probably could have.
He absolutely could have. He wasn't as popular, like most presidents, wasn't as popular in his second term. The shine was off the penny a little bit. But he could have stayed on, but he also was getting older. He's in his mid-60s at this point. Never wanted to be president in the first place, just wants to go back to his farm and retire. And if you ever get the chance, read his farewell address, much of it written by Hamilton. Brilliant, brilliant stuff. Some of the most important words ever written, I think, by an American president. Just really gives you a window into George Washington's heart and mind.
However, Washington was a man of principle above all else. As he had done with his military commission in 1783, he was ready to lay aside his power when the time came.
I say the two most important things George Washington ever did was in 1783, turning in his commission, and in 1796, choosing to retire and not run for re-election. He's teaching the country how to move on from him, how to not always have to be led by Washington, how to recognize that one man can't have all the power and influence.
And in doing so, established the traditional 2-term limit that has bound almost every future president. Washington left behind a robust system ready to meet the challenges of the future. But it was one torn by bitter political division that would only get worse as John Adams and Thomas Jefferson began their fight to inherit his office.
Yep.
If you'd like to...
All right, that was good stuff. I thought it was really well done, a great way of presenting the information. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.